Thank you all for coming. I'm Dan Folsby, the Dean of this law school. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. Today we have the pleasure of the company of Professor Tim Groseclose of the UCLA Economics faculty. Excuse me, the UCLA, you're jointly appointed in economics, but the UCLA Political Science faculty, who is here to talk to us about media bias and its effects, mostly malign, I'm sure. And I am not going to delay the beginning of this presentation 1 second longer. Professor Groseclose, the lectern is yours.
Well, first I want to say thank you to Dean Folsby. I want to say thank you to Thomas Haslett, whose idea this was, who called me up one day. I'm so honored and thrilled to be here. In 1991, I had a postdoc at George Mason at the other campus, and I'm already seeing basketball teammates, opponents, Henry's here. And for a long time I felt like George Mason, I'm part of the family. I talked to Kevin Greer one time, who told me that he had to be an official member of the George Mason family. Betty Tillman must have called me sugar, at least one time, I can say. And I'm also very proud these two other people feel like family who are not part of George Mason, Alex Mooney and Joe Liberato, former student and a good buddy, have come here, and I'm so pleased that they're here. So what I'm going to do is, let's see. Sure how we get my laptop on the screen. Awesome. Okay, great.
I'm a technology.
Man, I was panicking for a second. So what I'm going to do is talk about my book, and it has 4 parts.
In law school. Technology in the portfolio.
The book has 4 parts. I'm going to go through those 4 parts. I think I'm going to talk about 30 minutes, something like 7 on each part. Then I have a 5th part that I kind of added. I wanted to talk about the fairness doctrine, even though it's not around anymore. You never know, it could come back, and I still think it's interesting from a historical standpoint. So that's going to be part 5. That part is not part of the book. So first part, did everyone got, yeah, excellent. So I gave you some homework. Everyone got, Sarah set those out. So I'm going to start off with the book. The first part has nothing to do with the media, actually. It's just kind of the background for everything else I do. And I talk about political quotients, which I'll call PQ all the time. So you have a page for my book. There's 10 questions. You can compute your own PQ. If you go to my website, I have you can calculate a more precise version of your PQ. I have a 40-question quiz on my website, so timgroseclose.com. So I encourage everyone to do that. The great thing about the PQ questions, they all come from roll call votes in Congress. So what that means is that I can calculate the PQs of every member who's served in Congress since 1947. I've done this up to 2009, and so here you can, once you compute your PQ, you can compare yours to these different politicians. And as you see, they kind of go from 0 to 100. High scores are more liberal. I'll explain in a minute how some people can have a negative score or can be over 100. It's related to this first technical issue. So how do I compare these scores over time? So the first thing you may see that's maybe a little controversial is that I give, by my calculations, John F. Kennedy has a PQ of about 64, and Joe Lieberman has a PQ of about 74. So that means that by my results, Joe Lieberman, even though leftists often call him a conservative, I would call him kind of a left-leaning centrist, but by my results, Joe Lieberman is to the left of John F. Kennedy. And you say, now how can you say that? Those questions that you have on that sheet, those all came from 2009. I used more questions from other years, but Joe Lieberman and John F. Kennedy didn't overlap. By the way, all of John F. Kennedy's scores are based on his roll call votes when he was in Congress. Served for a few years in the House and then also as a senator. So how can you make that comparison? Well, it's a technical issue. I'll just give you briefly some of the things that are going on. It's very similar to the idea that any time a teacher faces when he or she wants to make 2 tests equally difficult. And so suppose you have, one test early in the term, another test later in the term, and one again, your Joe has actually taken 2 of my tests earlier and later in the term. If you're a professor, you might want them to be equally difficult. One way to do that is to make the questions equally difficult. Now, trust me, that's hard. Some of us, there's lots of teachers in here, and often you don't know how hard these questions are until you've actually had the students answer them. So another way is just to curve the test. So you look to see the students who took both tests, look to see which test had especially high scores or which test had especially low scores. You might add a few points to the ones on the especially low scores. Now, part of the reason I'm explaining this technical issue is to drop a name. I had co-authors when I did work on this curving the different tests, the different years of these roll call votes. One is Jim Snyder, who's now a professor of political science and economics at Harvard. And the other was, this is in 1994 when we started, there was a very bright grad student in MIT I met named Steve Levitt. Who's heard of Steve Levitt? More of you are going to raise your hand and say, he's the author of Freakonomics. And if I can brag for a moment, within a few months of meeting him, I recognized his talent. I predicted this guy's going to win the Nobel Prize. And I have verified with Steve, even his parents weren't predicting that when I did. I'm the very first to predict that Steve Levitt's going to win the Nobel Prize. And so what we do in this paper, we just kind of have ways to curve the different years of those roll call votes. So you have a quiz where there's 10 roll call votes. What I'm going to do is I have a series of 20 roll call votes in each year, and then I have to curve the different tests represented by the different years of in which there's 20 roll call votes. And so it's just a series of calculating these numbers, like if you have a 1947 score, you multiply it by 1.1, and then you subtract 10.2, and then that's an equivalent to the 2009 score. So we've done this, and with that, we argue in this paper in the American Political Science Review that once you do that, you can make comparisons over time, and that's why I think it is valid to say, with these PQ scores, that John F. Kennedy really was slightly more conservative than Joe Lieberman. Okay, so that's one point. Next one, say, keep in mind, I've calculated what I think is the average, the PQ of the average voter in the United States, and by my calculation, it's about 50.4. Okay, so that means it's about the views of Arlen Specter. So, well, when he was a Republican. These are all calculated before he switched over to Democrat. Some people said when he was a Republican, he's a rhino Republican. Well, by my calculations, he wasn't really rhino Republican in name only, but he was just barely a Republican. And I think the evidence of that is he actually did switch over to the Democratic Party. Some other centrists are Tom Campbell, fellow law school dean, Chapman College now. Ben Nelson, senator from Nebraska, Olympia Snowe, Susan Collins, basically kind of any kind of Northeastern Republicans or any kind of Democrats who are from a very conservative district, like Ben Nelson. One more is Charlie Wilson. Some of you may have seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, played by Tom Hanks. Charlie Wilson, by my measures, is very centrist.
Will you take a question?
Sure.
So how do you calculate for the public if these are survey questions? Are you taking survey data?
No, I'm not.
Looking at representatives. Is that
excellent question, and I think I put the slide way down here. So give me, let's see if I have it. It's all done from a regression, and I think, surely I put it in here. Yes, there. And it's all done with the assumption. So it's what I do is I have a big data set of PQs of House members and senators, okay? Then I know how their district voted, okay? So I just do a regression, take the Obama percentage in the district, regress that on the PQ of the representative, get an expected PQ of the representative, and then assume that on average, representatives are representative. On average, they have the same PQ as their average voter in their district. Maybe that's right, maybe wrong, but I'm not sure which way the bias would go, if either. So assuming that's true, and I just use this regression line to say, what is the PQ of the average voter? So given that, then we can just look at the whole nation, how the nation voted about 53-46. You look for 53% for Obama, come up to the line, and you get about 50.4. So that's how I do it. It's not from surveys. It's an excellent question. It's done by an estimate using the PQs of senators and congressmen. Okay. You know, I miss the days when we had overheads. That's what I wouldn't have to go through. Oh, I'm not going to call me old, but it's a lot of ways I don't like, probably understand.
So for each roll call vote, there's favoring it or opposing it, and one of those is going to be called liberal and the other is going to be called conservative?
Right.
So how is it that you designated which was which?
Excellent point. Excellent point. So, by the way, so I called them PQs. That original article I wrote with Steve Levitt and Jim Snyder, that was called something like what was the title? Looking at interest groups across time and chambers and something like adjusted ADA scores. So our main article looked at Americans for Democratic Action, the liberal interest group. It's in D.C. It's been around since 1947. And so I let them pick 20 roll call votes every year. And then they decide whether the yay or nay was actually conservative. And there's one controversial one, the importation of drugs. Actually, you know, it says that if you look at, I think it's number 9 on that list, that the ADA actually said, oh, man, I can't remember this. The ADA said that allowing Canadian drugs to be imported was the liberal position. It turns out Milton Friedman was in favor of that. So Milton Friedman agreed with the ADA on that one. So, you know, wait, is that really liberal? But on the other hand, if you look at Democrats actually voted slightly against the ADA. So, you know, it's controversial to have picked that. It's controversial which is liberal, yay or nay. But I wash my hands and say the ADA decides.
And they don't state their formula.
That's right. Although, you know, I was in this conference at a hotel in 1998. No, it was 1997 because it was the 50th. This strange thing. I'm at this hotel. It's in D.C. and a sign says 50th anniversary of the ADA. And I said, well, I've got to go talk to someone because I'm doing this work on it. And I talked to a guy who was like their press director who was involved with that. Every question I asked him, he said, we just picked the 20 most important votes for the liberal agenda. And I tried to get him, you know, to say, well, do you look to see how your friends voted? He did. No, we don't. Maybe they do, but he didn't. Yeah, so that's what he said. So anyway, so those are all PQs. So yeah, so I would call them adjusted ADA scores, but my publisher and literary agents, that is the most boring name you can think of. So political quotient is what I used. So using that same regression, I can say what's the average PQ for different regions of the country. So here's a list of all the states. It turns out, not counting D.C., Vermont is the most liberal, Utah is the most conservative, and the most centrist states, as you might guess, are ones that people have often called purple: Iowa, Colorado, Nevada. They're all about 50.4. Okay, so that's part 1, PQ. So now, let me talk a little about the media. First, part 2 of my book, where I explain a distortion theory of bias, and this is as opposed to a line theory of bias. And the idea is that this took me 8 years to write this book. I've done lots and lots of reading of transcripts and articles on LexisNexis, and trust me, it's extremely hard to find anything that I think is a false statement, either from the left, you know, from talk radio, Fox News, or from MSNBC. It's very hard. Instead, I think where the bias comes from is mainly it's from the facts and topics that journalists don't report. And so here's an example. But that part 2 has 3 chapters. First is chapter 6, where this is just a case study of an LA Times article. So what happened here was I was an insider on UCLA admissions. I was on the faculty oversight committee for UCLA admissions, and all of a sudden, you know, literally on my driveway, I picked the LA Times and implies basically how racist UCLA was, and the obstacles UCLA was putting up for black students to try to get into UCLA. But meanwhile, I'm on the inside telling these men that no, the opposite is true. That, you know, we are trying to bend over backwards, you know, trying not to violate Prop 209, which says you can't do race. We're trying to find all these proxies, and and I just got angry at this article, and I started reading it. And what's making me angry? What's the false statement? Couldn't find any. And finally, I just realized, no, what's going on is there's all these facts that I know that would be relevant. Any moderate reader would want to know these facts, and especially any conservative reader would want to know these facts that I knew. That kind of made the case against affirmative action. The facts that the journalist was reporting were all facts that kind of made the case for affirmative action. So I have a list about 6 or 7, no more than that, something like 10 or 12 facts that say, here are the facts that someone against affirmative action would have wanted you to know. Meanwhile, the journalist did not report those facts. You left those out. So that's Chapter 6. Chapter 7 is to say, well, here's one way you can have a biased article is just within the topic not report all the relevant facts. But another way, I argue, is just what topics you pick. What's the subject that you're writing about? And there are some important subjects that often are not reported in the media, and they're often subjects that conservatives would want you to know and that the liberals are ignoring. Things like the Van Jones saga. This was Obama's green job czar, who was a self-avowed communist. Eventually resigned, dramatic fashion, just past midnight one Saturday night. And meanwhile, if you look at the mainstream media, especially the New York Times, did not have any articles at all about him during that prior week before he resigned, despite the fact there were some members of Congress who were calling on him to resign. That's Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is how did the political views of a journalist influence the stories he or she decides to pursue. And so what I want to argue is that if you have this distortion theory of bias, that it would be very, very hard for someone to don this. If you're a hardcore conservative, it's hard for you to don the skin of a moderate and report like a moderate, and the opposite. If you're a liberal, it's very hard to act like this, especially picking the subjects and facts. To illustrate that, I found this great case. There's a woman named Catherine Person who was hired at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. She was hired as an experiment at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune to hire a conservative, put a conservative in the newsroom. So here's quoting from my book, and I'm actually quoting from the Rake magazine. It says, when the tinny tinkle of Joy to the World, the Lord has come, begins playing on the cell phone, everyone in range in the Star-Tribune newsroom knows who's getting a call. It's Catherine Person, the paper's unapologetically religious and fiercely conservative Metro columnist. Since May 2005, the Star-Tribune has been engaged in what its editor freely describes as an experiment. The test has Catherine Kirsten, a 55-year-old former banker and think tank denizen, now an opinion writer, playing the role of an alien element injected into a tradition-bound newspaper culture. So what I do is I examine a case study of an article that she wrote. The article has to do with the flying imams. You may remember this. This was 6 or 7 years ago. There was these imams on this flight from Minneapolis to Phoenix, and they started acting kind of suspicious on this flight. They wouldn't sit in their assigned seats. Some of them were getting these seatbelt extenders, even though none of them were fat enough to need them. Then they weren't even using them. They were acting, some people would say, suspiciously like terrorists. Some of the passengers reported them to the airline. They got booted off the plane, and they sued the airline, U.S. Airways, and the airport. Okay, now that was the story. And it turns out they were also suing these passengers, and no one reported that. And this Catherine Kirsten is the one who reported that. I want to argue that this was an important story. It actually caused Congress to change the law. Congress actually passed a law to shield these passengers, these what they were calling John Doe passengers. The imams didn't know the names of them. They were going to get this through the discovery phase of the lawsuit. And I want to argue that there's no way this story would have been reported if Catherine Kirsten hadn't existed, and also it wouldn't have been reported if Catherine Kirsten didn't have conservative views. So here's the quoting from the book. All right, before Kirsten wrote the flying imam story, several journalists reported aspects of it. What they failed to note, however, was that the lawsuit targeted not just the airline, but also unnamed John Doe passengers. Okay, I've already told you that. Many of the stories, said Kirsten, did little more than copy facts from the press release of the CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, an ally of the imams. With that story, said Kirsten, the typical reporter would investigate a little and say, nope, nothing more there. But I did some research on those guys, and there was one, Omar Shaheen, who had a very checkered background. When I researched him, it took so much time. I worked so many hours. Yeah, my conservative perspective definitely contributed. If you're not interested, if you don't see a story, you won't do it. To do these sort of things, you need to have a sort of antenna up, that there may be something fishy about those guys. Most reporters didn't have that antenna. Okay, so that's part 2, the distortion theory of bias, and now I want to get onto the evidence of media bias. So first thing, talk about the voting behavior of journalists, just what happens when you look at surveys. So I begin with what I believe is the most important fact to know if you want to understand media bias. And this is that in a typical presidential election, Washington correspondents vote about 93-7 for the Democrat. Okay, now that's a lot. Now, I also want to argue that if I had told you it was 80-20, you would have called that a lot, right? Told it was 70-30, you would have also called that a lot. And what I want to argue in this part of the book is that this 93-7 is qualitatively different from 80-20 or 7-30. There's a lot of implications of just how lopsided that is. Yeah, yes.
What's your source for that?
This was, oh man, you know what? It was a poll, you know, and I said Freedom Forum poll, and then Brent Bozell actually wrote a review of the book and said he got it wrong. Now, I was quoting Eric Alterman quoting this, so the source is the poll is right, but my source is slightly wrong. I said Freedom Forum. I got the name. I think it's Lane Lichter. I can't remember exactly. It's in the footnotes. Now, but then John Tierney, a columnist for the New York Times, did a follow-up on this, and he didn't call it scientific, but he just asked lots of his friends. He asked Washington people reporting on the 2004 election and asked, who do you think would make a better president, George W. Bush or John F. Kerry? And he found 92-8. So I have two, and then I have lots of other things. I try to argue that if you look at local reporters, it's not as high as that 93-7. If you include local reporters, it's something like 75-25. But on the other hand, I would argue in the book that I think for a lot of reasons that may even be understated, at least among national reporters. So anyway, I'll invite more. We'll talk about that.
Is there a canonical list of who is a correspondent and who isn't?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Here I am in Washington, and I correspond with people all the time, but I'm not a correspondent, I gather.
There's Elaine Lichter. She documented exactly. Yeah, so this was the days before the internet when she did that, so it's probably a little more clear. Yeah, that would be especially tough today, I think. But this 93-7, so I want to say this is important, that this is large, so large that this is even larger in terms of voting for the Democrat than Berkeley, California. At least the congressional district of Berkeley, California only voted 90-10 for Obama. And meanwhile, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the congressional district that contains Cambridge, Massachusetts, voted 86-14. So that means that the Republicans the Republican voters in Cambridge, Massachusetts are about double the number of Republican voters in Washington newsroom. So I'd argue that's very high. Another illustration of just how high that 93-7 is the following. This is chapter 11, where I tried to find the anti-newsroom. So the idea is that what if we found a group of people that voted 93-7 for the Republican? So I wanted to find a county in the U.S. that voted about 93-7 for the Republican. Turns out there is no county unless you count King County, Texas, which only has 200 people. So not counting King County, Texas, there's really nothing that's 93-7. The one that comes closest, that has 100,000 people, is within a day's drive of L.A., is Washington County, Utah. And it turns out they voted 77-23 for McCain. By the way, if anyone's been here, California, most people know, this St. George is the county seat. Does anyone know? That's great hiking country. Anyone has kids between 10 and 17 may have seen High School Musical 2. It's filmed in Washington County. Beautiful scenery. So when I did this chapter, I wanted to do a case study. What would the anti-newsroom look like? So I just wanted to find a group of people that voted something like 93-7 for the Republican. So I went to Washington County and I looked for the most conservative person I could find. First, let me explain something. There's something weird about Washington County. It was founded by Brigham Young. He sent these former cotton growers down because this was just before the Civil War. He was scared that Salt Lake City would not have a source of cotton. So all these cotton growers founded Washington County, and everything is named Dixie. there. It's the strangest thing. So there is a store named Dixie Gun and Fish. Okay, it's a gun shop, and this is the owner. His name's Tom Sigmiller. So a guy actually I love talking to. We really grew to admire. I'd say I look for the most conservative person in the county. He's probably not the most conservative, but he is pretty darn conservative. As I say, I really grew to admire this guy, and the best three-word phrase I thought of to describe this guy is American exceptionalism personified. And here's what I mean by that. First, American exceptionalism is coined by Alexis de Tocqueville. What it means is that America is fundamentally different from economically advanced countries like Europe, and in lots of different ways. And one is that we Americans attend religious services more, we have more kids, we have more friendly attitudes toward capitalism, we're more entrepreneurial, and we own more guns. Meanwhile, Tom Sigmiller is a devout Mormon. He has 8 kids. He owns 2 successful businesses. One's the gun shop. The other's an athletic supply store. In fact, this is a picture in the athletic supply store. And you can't quite see it on this, but if you look at the top picture above the deer horns, that's a picture of Jesus. Below the deer horns is a picture of George Washington. And then the bottom plaque just beside him says, given to him by one of his kids, proclaiming him world's greatest dad. Sigmiller, I largely agree. I suspect his PQ is something about 0. Mine's about 13, by the way. So I largely agree with him, disagree on some things. But despite my agreement, I wanted to see if I could get a rise out of him. So I asked him a question. I said, look, isn't a gun more likely to kill a family member accidentally than to kill an intruder? Aren't you better off just using alarms of police? And I did. I got in there, he said. Now, that's an absolute fallacy. In fact, that's almost a Hillary Clinton-like cliche. The people who say things like that have no knowledge about guns. It's as if you take someone with a kindergartner's knowledge, but for some reason you give them a podium. Okay, so that was Tom Sigmiller, the most conservative guy. And I also looked for the most liberal person in Washington County. So, for strange reasons, there's this weird gerrymandering in Utah that connects the Salt Lake City suburbs with the lower 2 corners of the state. And so this Washington County is actually represented by a Democrat. And that Democrat is Jim Matheson. So he has an office in Washington County, has 1 staff member named Mike Impey. So I thought, okay, I'm going to interview a Democrat, and let's try to see the county through his eyes. So here's a typical quote that Impey told me. He said, my job is to show up at community and political functions and maintain a presence for Jim Matheson in Washington County. I try to convince people that we are not like the National Democratic Party. We're not extreme environmentalists. We're not rabid George Bush haters. And I try to explain to people that you can be a Mormon and still be a Democrat. Okay. So the key points of Chapter 11 is that in the mirror image of a newsroom, that conservatives outnumber liberals 93-7. Views like Tom Sigmiller's, I bet, would still be right of center in such a thing, but they would still, I would argue, be in the mainstream. And meanwhile, Mike Impey's views would be considered, if not the left-wing fringe, at least kind of out there. They would be considered a little strange, a little liberal for the rest of the newsroom. Okay, so that is some evidence on just how journalists feel in their heart. That's not necessarily mean that they're reporting, that their content is actually biased, and that's what I want to discuss next. This all began with a peer-reviewed paper that I wrote with Jeff Milo. This was in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. That paper is 48 pages long, but I urge you, don't read that whole paper, just look at 1 page. You get the whole gist of the entire paper just from this 1 page. This is Figure 2, and you can't see it, but I'm going to explain. In this paper, we compute what I now call slant quotients. Okay, and let me give you an example of that. One is that the New York Times has a slant quotient of 74. Now, to see this from the figure, the third from the top is the New York Times. You follow the arrow down, it goes, you see Joe Lieberman is there, and you follow it all the way over to this y-axis. It's about 74. Now, what that means is that by our method, the average article in the New York Times sounds about as liberal as the average Joe Lieberman speech. And the reason is because Joe Lieberman also has a PQ of 74. Okay, so that's basically what our method does. It says, it's a thought experiment. It says, what if I gave you a set of articles or transcripts, and instead of telling you that it was from a newspaper or media outlet, falsely told you that it was a speech by a politician, and then I ask you, guess the political views of that politician, that would-be politician, and then that's how we solve that, the slant quotient. So that's, I say 74 is the slant quotient of the New York Times. More specific, how I do that, or Jeff Milo and I do that, we look at think tank citations. So what that means is that when the New York Times cites left-wing, centrist, right-wing think tanks, that it picks a mix of think tanks that's about the same mix that Joe Lieberman picks when he cites think tanks on the Senate floor. Okay, so that's the idea behind the SQ, the slant quotient. So that's one method to measure slant quotient. In the book, I had two other chapters describing other methods, in particular using other data. One is what I call the loaded phrase method, and this was introduced by Matt Ginskamp and Jesse Shapiro, two University of Chicago Business School economists. And their method is loaded phrases. And an example of a loaded phrase would be estate tax or death tax. So the idea is that which one you use reveals your position on the issue. They had a computer program, looked through all the congressional speeches. This computer program found phrases that Democrats use more than Republicans or vice versa, and they had a big list of loaded political phrases, and they used a similar method that Milo and I did, and from that you can calculate slant quotients. A third way I can calculate slant quotients is just look at the facts that the media report, and in one chapter I look at an example of the Bush tax cuts, and the idea is that there was a set of facts that liberals wanted everyone to know, and this was that the rich received a disproportionate share of the tax cuts. You hear things like, oh, the richest 1% are going to get 30% of the benefits. And these facts were largely true. We could quibble over where it was really 28% or 32%, but the rich really were receiving a disproportionate amount of those the tax cuts. Meanwhile, conservatives would argue a different set of facts that were equally true. And a big one, important one, was that the cuts actually made the income tax system more progressive. And the idea is that the rich actually would pay a larger percent of the taxes after the cuts than before. And so you could look at that, do something similar that I did with the think tank method to see, you know, what's the ratio of facts that you're reporting, then compare that to congressional speeches, and I could have another way to compute SQs from that. Okay, then I sum all of this up in this figure. Remember I said that the average PQ of America is about 50.4. I have a Gallup survey that asks people where they get their news, and I looked at the independents, the moderates, that said where they get their news. I used those numbers to weight all these media outlets, and I compute this big weighted average of the slant quotients of all the media in the U.S. And so I argue that using everything, talk radio, Fox News, cable TV, the internet, you add all those up, this big weighted average, I get that the average slant quotient of the entire U.S. media is about 58.5. Okay. Now remember, higher scores are more liberal, so I'm finding a liberal bias. You know, 50.4 would be perfectly centrist. So now, actually, though, one could argue that that bias is actually pretty small. So I'm saying that the media are about 8 points more liberal than center. Meanwhile, my method also says that a Joe Lieberman speech is about 24 points more liberal than center. So by my estimates, there is a liberal bias to the media, but it's only about 1/3 the bias of the average Joe Lieberman speech. And some people would say, well, that's not that liberal. Maybe not. But regardless, I do find a definite liberal bias. Okay, next, the effects of the media. This is part 4 of the book. So in the book, I review a number of academic articles that are something like experiments. For instance, some Yale researchers actually came down to the Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. suburbs. Some of you could have been subjects in this, and they said, we're going to do an experiment. We're going to first, they contacted the Washington Post, Washington Times, found out who was not receiving either newspaper, found a group of voters not receiving a newspaper, called them up and said, hey, look, we're going to offer you a subscription to the Washington Post or Washington Times. What they did is just before calling them, they flipped a coin. So if it's heads, they would offer them a subscription to Washington Post, tails, a subscription to Washington Times. So the idea is they're acting like biologists. They have a real treatment and control group, which is determined randomly. And after this, they found that indeed the Washington Post subscribers voted more liberally. So you can argue, and I believe, that caused them to vote more liberally. Okay? So I have a number of academic articles I reviewed that say that, look, there really is an effect of the media, that it really can influence our thoughts and voting.
Your cause and effect in that experiment would be that if I chose the Washington Times, it's because they influenced me to be more liberal, as opposed to the fact that
You're not choosing.
What?
You're not choosing it.
Well, they were not, yeah, the coin flip chose for you, yeah.
Right, but I didn't understand your cause and effect. What was the cause, what was the effect?
That the slant of the media could actually cause your views to change, cause you to vote differently, with a few voters. That wasn't many, but they found that the Post subscribers voted for the Democrat 3.8 percentage points higher than the Times subscribers. So it's not a lot, but I look at those numbers and say, well, given how little of our news probably came from the newspaper, maybe that is a lot, but still. But the key thing is these guys were acting like biologists, and this is pretty remarkable for political science, I'd argue. So now, given that, if you agree with me in my review of this academic literature, that the media really can influence our thoughts and our voting behavior, that means, and if you agree with my results, that the media is at least slightly more liberal than center, then that means that this Y, this 50.4, the views we observe in voters, that's artificial. That has been pulled to the left, to the liberal side, at least a little bit, by the media. Okay? So I want to argue, the question is, how much has that been pulled? And so I want to discuss a concept, I'll call it X. Now, the natural views of voters, and what I mean by that is the views they would have if it weren't for media bias. So if either they could magically not be influenced at all by the media, or if they could magically get their news reported in a fashion that they would exactly like. If the media reported S equal to X, then that's the definition of this X. That's what I mean by natural views. Okay, to estimate that, so I have a simple model, and I try to keep the math out of this book, but there's one chapter where I have one little equation, and I do just a teeny bit of algebra. I just assume that this Y is a factor of two forces, that it's X and S, and each of them are pulling on that average voter. So the media is pulling the average voter that way, the natural views, say the DNA, parental upbringing, things like that, are pulling them the other way. And what we see is the equilibrium of those two forces, and that's currently at 50.4. And so if we can, the next in the book, using these experiments, I try to get an estimate of this lambda, which is the weight on the media force, and I argue the best estimate is about 0.7. With that, with an estimate of, if we have Y, S, and lambda, then it's just a matter of algebra to get X. And I estimate X is about 31.5. I argue that to get that 31.5, I made a number of assumptions that I argue erred on the side of making it look too large. So really, more likely, X might be 25 or 30. So that's my estimate. If I'm right, that means that we can perform this thought experiment. What if we can magically get rid of the influence of the media, or magically make the media report without any bias? How would America think and vote? And the answer is about like Texas. Okay? So it's about 25 to 30, and here are some states where the average PQ is about 25 to 30. Dan.
Can you go back to the previous, so where does your estimate of lambda come from?
Well, okay, it's from those academic studies, okay? And the idea, this may be more details than people want. If you notice that if this is y, you can take the derivative of y with respect to s, and it's lambda. So what that means is that if you move s a little bit, move the slant of the media, then y should change lambda times s. So if you can find in these experiments, so for instance, I look at that Washington Times, Washington Post study to say, like, how much did they change the slant of the two different groups? And I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was something like 8 slant quotient points. And then I can't remember, then suppose y moved something like 7 PQ points. And then so my estimate from that of lambda would be 7 divided by 8. And so it's with 3 experiments I do some calculations like that.
But just to continue on this topic a little bit, another way to make sure I understand this. So it seems like what you're saying is that people's views are kind of 70% determined by the media and 30% determined by whatever.
Yeah.
And what is the whatever? I mean, the natural views. Where do natural views come from?
Well, I like to think of it as like your DNA. I believe a lot of our views come from our genetics, but also maybe parental upbringing, early, and then there's surely other forces on that, but I also have kind of a ceteris paribus assumption that all the other forces are being held constant. But the idea is that you look in these cases where there's been an experiment and we can magically change the media, okay, like this experiment with Washington Times, Washington Post. And I guess you might argue all the natural things are all the other factors. You might argue that, but
These natural views of the average voter, so that makes me think views about some political topic, like taxes or military spending or healthcare or something like that. I guess I'm finding a little bit hard to relate that back to genetics. I mean, I would think that voters, thinking about adult human beings here, that they would base it on something, right? So they have something, so I'm still having a little trouble figuring out, where they would get this information back. They just like, whatever their father told them or their mother told them.
What's the thought experiment
Okay.
you're imagining to generate your baseline? That is, are we imagining people that are living in a world without, you say without media, I don't know what media are, without books, without newspapers, without television, without radio, so all the information that one gets, we're sort of going back to, let's say, an English Hamlet in the year 1100. All the information that you get from the outside world is you get from your grandmother, if she's still alive, you get from your neighbor by word of mouth. You can't read, so you don't read. There are no books. That's the baseline. So what is an English the inhabitant, the agricultural worker in an English Hamlet in the year 1100 think?
Okay.
Is that the thought experiment?
Well, let's see, maybe. Let me give you a precise way I can define it, and then let's try to think about that, how that would mean in your context. There's 2 ways how I can precisely define X. And one way is X is what we would observe. So Y is what we observe. So if we could make S equal to that magical X. And here's another way to think of that thought experiment. So I currently have Y at about 50, and I have S at about 58. Now, there's some people say, well, to make the media unbiased, you need to have the slant equal to about the views of the voter, to have the slant equal to what the voter would prefer, okay? Now, if that happened, so if you moved S, told the media, you've got to move 8 points more conservative, So all of a sudden, S is at 50. What would happen is, because if this lambda is positive, that when the media moves 8 points this way, which it's left on the graph, but it's conservative, right? That's unfortunate. So if it moves 8 points in the conservative direction, by my model, that means that Y has got to move lambda times those 8 points. So about 0.7 times those 8 points. So if the media moves in the conservative direction, the average voter will also move in the conservative direction. Okay, so if that happened, all of a sudden, this is going to be, what is 8 points times 0.7, that's about 5.6, so they're going to move about 6 points this way to about 44, and that's the new Y, I'll bet S prime, okay? And so the idea is, one way to find X is to repeat this thought experiment. Now say, what if we move the slant? Now all of a sudden there's still bias because there's a new Y. What if we could repeat this thought experiment, move S here, but then Y would move here, move S here, Y would move here? You could repeat this an infinite number of times. There would actually, it turns out, you can show the math, that there's actually a point that it's like Zeno's paradox, if you're familiar with that. They actually catch up. S actually catches up with Y. And I'm defining X as the point where they catch up. Okay? And so another way to think of it is just, find X, or what is the S such that X equals Y, and that's a way to solve that. And so, if I can just say one more thing, another way, so that's one thought experiment to define X. Another thought experiment is just to say, what if we could magically make lambda 0, magically make the influence of the media nothing? If we did that, then you show Y would equal X in that case. So whatever Y is, when you magically make the effect of the media 0, that's also my definition of X. So, Alex.
I mean, I understand what you're doing, but you're all basing this on difference between the Washington Post and the Washington Times. Another way of saying what you're saying is, well, if everybody got the Washington Times instead of the Washington Post, we'd all be a little bit more conservative, but then the Washington Times, that would look like a liberal newspaper. So, so when you extend this, then implicitly what you're saying is that a unbiased media would be so conservative that there's no media today which may actually represent what an unbiased media would look like. So you're far. So it seems like you're taking you're basing your estimate on the difference between the Washington Times and the Washington Post, and you're extrapolating to a media market which looks completely different than the one we have.
True. That's true. True. Yeah, and my X is about 30. My estimate of the Washington Times, I think it was like 32. So if I'm right, so if we could, and my X is right, that means that in that world, Washington Times seems centrist. So this is kind of like, no one say my claims are boring. They're very controversial. Yes.
I may have missed this part, but you throw around the terms liberal, conservative, as if these are defined terms, and they are single points in space, and the only points that lie in any other in that in whatever hyperspace is along the line that connects the two. All right, and that's your obviously wrong. Okay, because number one, there's no consensus view on what's liberal and what's conservative. And the second thing is there's no reason to believe that it's single dimensional or two dimensional or multi-dimensional. How many dimensions there really are to it? I don't agree with you that Joe Lieberman, for example, is a liberal. All right, I think he's actually pretty conservative. I wouldn't put him up there. And the other thing I'd like to ask you is, how precise is precise? You say it's precise, but what kind of measurement of any system can you talk about when you never talk about what the error is in your supposed measurement of whatever it is you're measuring?
Well, okay, let's see. First, let's see. I want to get all these points. So, let's see. dimensional, try to define liberal, precision. Okay. First, I hope, what is the, please read chapter 4. You live in LA, you're meeting all kinds of Hollywood types, and if you're conservative, usually they're pretty liberal. And so everyone's heard of Hollywood producer George Lucas, right? Well, it turns out Hollywood producer Lucas George, there really is a guy, and he lives by me. He's extremely liberal, and we got in this. He asked many of the same questions you asked that. We got this.
Now, how do you know he's liberal? How do you know he doesn't meet my definition of liberal? Where's the dictionary definition that
You still haven't let him answer the question?
He said all those things. We got an
Forget
argument.
about what he said. I'm asking
He's
what you're
answering the
saying.
question. No, he said let him answer.
Yes, I'm trying to say that, like, it's a very important point, and I devote a whole chapter to it. That's what this the background of it. And so we are, and in fact we got in this argument. How do you know I'm moderate? And so I said, so when I define PQ, I just use the definition that political scientists tend to use, and that's something like the Americans for Democratic Action. I think you came in late, right? So that's how I define the question. So you have the PQs, they're all defined, chosen by the Americans for Democratic Action. And I say, why should they choose? Well, one, that's what political scientists use. They've been around since 1947. And the others, I say there's lots of other measures. I could have used Americans for Conservative Union, American Conservative Union scores. Now, it turns out the correlation coefficient between those two interest groups is something like 0.97, or it's actually negative 0.97 because they're the opposite. You could use denominate scores. This is the scores by Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal. Same thing. You get a correlation coefficient of about 0.97. There's just a number of measures that political scientists use that would all give you the same.
Why isn't it measures that of the people that sort of like the people who form the total population? Why isn't it from there?
Well, that's what
they think. It's not what these institutions think and what they define it as.
Well,
because first off, you haven't really answered my question about the multidimensional.
Right, okay. Yeah, I'm answering this one first. Sorry. I would argue, if you look at nominate scores, are you familiar with Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal's work?
I come from an engineering background.
Okay, well,
systems. And
Okay, the answer is no. Go ahead.
Read their work. So they don't poll voters, but they do use every roll call vote in Congress. And they say, let's just code these votes 0 and 1 by how people vote yea or nay. Let's find a dimension, let's find a number that tries to estimate, gives the best prediction of how these members of Congress are going to vote. So they do that. They find one dimension, give a number to each member of Congress, they give a number to each yea and nay position on that they vote on in Congress, and they come up, Poole and Rosenthal, come up with also a set of numbers which would also allow you to say how people are, their preferences in Congress. So they don't force their numbers to be liberal or conservative, but it turns out their dimension, which they would argue best represents the conflict in Congress, you get results such that Ted Kennedy, or just like my PQ scores, you get the Barney Franks and Nancy Pelosi's, they have the very high scores on their dimension. You get the Michelle Bachmans and Jim DeMint on there. So what we commonly call, what the Americans for Democratic Action calls liberal or conservative, turns out to be highly correlated with what Poole and Rosenthal called the dimension of maximal conflict within Congress. So that's not quite the people, but at least it's Congress. So I think I'm on solid ground. What I call liberal or conservative, it's at least what political scientists call, and it's at least what members of Congress would call liberal or conservative. By the way, Americans for Democratic Action, their honorary presidents have been Barney Frank, John Lewis.
It doesn't faze me. I'm not taking a liberal or conservative viewpoint. I'm saying what you do is you set up a hypothesis that people are one or the other or something linearly between the two, and then you say you're measuring it, You don't say anything about the preciseness of your measurements, even though you use the word precise, all right? And it makes absolutely no sense, because at least in my view, I find the world's far richer and having more depth in terms of what real people's views are than what people in Congress do.
Okay, let's see. I'll answer the precision now. So at least with members of Congress, I can report the standard deviation for my estimate of their PQ. And this all comes from my paper with Steve Levitt and Jim Snyder. Okay, so I don't report standard errors of these PQs of these members of Congress in the book, but I could give them to you.
Well, let's just say for the sake of argument, there's a tolerance of error on each of your numbers, right? And you don't disclose what those tolerance of error is. And you make these presumptions that things are to the left of something else, for example, as opposed to the right. And you suggest that these are significant differences, yet you kind of say, well, they're not really, but you don't disclose what the precision is.
Well, I can calculate it. Yeah, I don't write it in this book, but yeah, I'm trying to make this more popular.
What is the precision?
Well, I don't know for anyone, but if, with Joe Lieberman, for instance, so when he was a Democrat, I have about 25 years worth of
What is the
scores.
74.7 plus or minus.
The standard errors for him, given that I have 25 years, 20 votes for each year. Let me finish, please. 20 votes for each year. It's going to be something like probably a standard error of 2.5, something like that. So I don't report in the book, but I could.
Did you calculate it?
Yes, we did with Levitt and Snyder. Yeah, my original peer-reviewed article. We did things like that. Finally, for the multi-dimension, let me say this. Excellent point, by the way. One thing that happens, I think with most people, I think, I'm trying to capture preferences and ideology, and at best this is an approximation. So I'm forcing this to be one-dimensional, as you say, right? Now, Poole and Rosenthal actually say, look, we all know this is multi-dimensional, so let's nominate scores in 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions. So they do it for lots and lots, and they find first that 1 dimension does very well to explain the votes. And I argue that for the first approximation that it does very well, but there's occasionally some that don't do so well. For instance, Ron Paul. Okay, so by my score, Ron Paul is kind of a right-leaning moderate, even though I'd argue that on any position, he's basically extreme on any position. The problem is that on economic issues, he's extreme right, foreign policy issues, he's extreme left. And so when I'm jamming him down, what happens is we have economic right, and this is foreign policy right. What happens is in Congress you have Republicans are all here, Democrats are all here, and you have lots of other people in the middle, but then you occasionally get someone like Ron Paul who's here. And I'm projecting his preference into this one-dimensional space.
So basically you're predicting voting patterns in Congress, which is by definition polarized. The workers, you have Republican parties and the Democratic Party, and they work together and trade votes, and they vote as blocks. That's all.
Well, largely, but you do have, there's some who are not that way. You get some rhino Republicans, you get some blue dog Democrats.
I suggest we get the rest of the talk, and hopefully we will have time for questions at the end.
Final point. Let's see. So, okay, that is the effects of the media. Finally, I think I'm almost out of time, but I wanted to talk something about the fairness doctrine. So, it's a regulation, not a statute, passed in on the FCC in 1949, was abolished, but we never know. There's been talk of reinstating it. In the actual language of the fairness doctrine, they say things that that media outlets must present controversial issues at times and do it in a balanced way. And I want to argue that the definition of controversial and balanced, that this basically means centrist. And that basically means that the slant must be near the PQ of the average voter. Okay, so I had a great example of a comedian. I'm supposed to end at 5 though, right?
No, we have that 5:30.
So 5:30, okay, great, okay. So here is an illustration of what I mean by this, to try to put some bones on what centrist, controversial, imbalance means. So Ron White says, maybe my favorite comedian, so the biggest difference between Texas and California is in Texas we have a death penalty and we use it. They're trying to pass a bill through the Texas legislature that'll speed up the process of execution in heinous crimes where there's more than 3 credible eyewitnesses. If more than 3 people saw what you did, you don't sit in death row for 15 years, Jack. You go straight to the front of the line. While other states are trying to abolish the death penalty, my state's putting in an express lane. So, okay, so what I want to argue is that in today's America, or at least play along with me for this thought experiment, that something like question, should a state have a death penalty, that's controversial, and that a centrist is like equally distanced from yay and nay on that. But meanwhile, in Texas, that's not controversial. Most people, at least according to Ron White, most people are for the death penalty. What's controversial is should there be an express lane for the death penalty, and more seriously, what happens with that express lane he's talking about, they eliminate some of the appeals. And so I'd argue in Texas, that's what's controversial. That's what, and a centrist is, on the fence on that issue, but not the death penalty issue. Okay, so next, what I want to argue is that, so you have to define centrist and controversial to talk about the fairness doctrine. In my view, centrist and controversial should be defined by X, not Y. I want to argue that this Y is pretty ephemeral. That is actually caused by what the media is doing, and it's not the natural views. To think about this, if in contrast, centrist really meant Y, and the media really can influence our views, that my estimate of lambda, that it's pretty large, something like 0.7 is right, then that means that centrist, at least to a partial extent, is defined in a circular manner. That is, the media can move left. Media that might think the media is to the left, but that will cause voters to move to the left, and then all of a sudden voters won't think the media is to the left, if that lambda is really high. And to just give one more example, so I estimated lambda at about 0.7, but who knows if that's right? Maybe it's even higher, maybe it's lower, but suppose for the moment that it's 0.95, suppose that X is about 30. Here's a graph of what things would look like. If lambda is 0.95, the media moves its slant to 50, then the average voter is going to move to 49, so almost exactly 50. Meanwhile, if the media moves even more left, something like, I'd argue, MSNBC. So if the average media is about like MSNBC, and that lambda is 0.95, then that Y is going to be something like 87. On the other hand, what if all the media become like talk radio, where S is something like 10, then the views are going to become something like 11. I used to live, so the key is that centrist, we define it by Y, is going to mean approximately whatever the media is reporting in this thought experiment. It is something like a joke. We used to say when I lived in Columbus, Ohio, they used to say that if you don't like the weather in Columbus, just wait a few minutes. The idea is that's always changing. It's going to be something different. So if the media is non-centrist, just allow your views to change with the media. That is, that lambda is 0.95. So my final point is that if so, that this, I think, points out the problems in defining centrist in the observed views. I want to say that it would be more proper to define centrist in terms of that X and not that Y. And if we do that, my final point is just a small point about the FCC's fairness doctrine, is that if we need to define centrist, controversial, and balanced in terms of X, that's much more difficult than defining in terms of y, and that to define those terms is a tougher problem and it's tougher to implement than I think anyone has really realized. If that is true, if that lambda is very high. Okay, so I will end it there and take questions.
Because of the nature of the bulk of the we're analyzing, you treat it not, I don't think they're very well, other things, they're all the major items you're analyzing are like one side of the median of the average. But for the last 10 or 15 years, there's been some diversification in the television market, especially diversifying the reports. Does that mean that you would predict what an elongation of the focal spectrum as a result of that? Because many people are talking towards liberal positions like liberal medium plus, some others are.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, let me find one of these graphs. By the way, when I calculate S, it comes from a Gallup survey, and it asks independents where they got their news. So that S, I'm arguing, that's what independents are getting. That's what moderates are getting. Now, definitely that's true, and we have, when I did these results, actually, most of the data come from pre-2005. And then MSNBC was actually pretty centrist at the time. During this whole time, talk radio is becoming more and more popular. Fox News has probably increased its audience share. So, yes, there's outlets on both sides, and I think you're right, that in the past decade or two, they've been moving more so. Now, so Y is moving here, but say you get to choose your media, okay, and you are on the right, and you're choosing something over here, yeah, that would cause you to move that way, and same thing on the left. So I think you're exactly right.
Capture these dynamical movements. I mean, it seems pretty central to your thesis that you get a linear representation of what's going on, and yet your methodology is almost against that because in your temporal cross sections here, you're comparing non-Kennedy with Joe Lieberman, and you're sort of grading on the curve. You're setting each Congress in effect 0, and that sort of methodological attitude deprives you of the capacity to sort of see motion and in people's views and compare it to some underlying movement, right? You see what I'm saying?
I think.
If Gerard is right, and he clearly is, I mean, most of us grew up in a world in which there were 3 media outlets, basically, that were generating news, and if there were more, they were getting their news from these places, okay? Now there are lots of mobs, and the prediction should be people's attitudes and perceptions are moving, and do you have a capture of that? Are you able to see that?
Yeah, I heard you say the word static, and I have to say, mea culpa. This is, a snapshot in time. All the data was between late 90s to early 2000s. And, just in my defense, it takes a long time to gather the data. It took me 8 years. So that would be an excellent study, but, it would take a long time.
Now, I'm not a mathematician, so maybe this is a stupid question, but it seems to me you're making an assumption with your equation, and I could be wrong, correct me. But don't you need 2 different lambdas? How can you find x, like on both, on the left and the right of y? There are forces, right?
Right.
You made the assumption, correct, that lambdas, but what do you know about the left side of lambda?
Yeah, excellent question.
Wouldn't x be further to the left if that is weaker, for instance?
I think I do. Yeah. So when I talk about lambda, I always mean the influence of the media on the average voter, on the moderate voter. Okay. And you asked a question about on the extremes, and I kind of waved my hand about that. Now, I actually discuss in the book, I said this 0.7, I admit that seems high to me. And I have a few pages where I say, well, here's why maybe it's not, and I discuss kind of how flimsy views of moderates are. They're often not as informed as the extremists. So, for instance, you could ask people, when Dennis Hastert was Speaker, you could ask people, who is the Speaker of the United States? And moderates, only something like 20% of moderates could get it right, while something like 60% of the extremists could get it right. So I want to argue that if instead, now all my analysis is looking only at how these middle voters are changing. And so when I, look at that Washington Times, Washington Post, that 3.8%, those are all marginal changes. Those are people at about the cut line between those two candidates. All the changes I'm looking at are how moderates change their views. So, so I'm basically silent in the book on how extremists change their views. And you're right. If I did do that analysis to talk about how extremists change their views, I might need a different lambda for the extremists. And I actually argue in the books that the lambda for the extremists is probably less.
I was more referring to the pull of the natural views is not something you
The pull of the natural views.
Of the natural views that I think you really need to.
Oh, well, I'm just assuming that the sum of the forces sum to 1. So that, the sum of the force is 100%. So I'm just saying that the pull of the x is just 1 minus lambda. Yeah. So, sorry.
Question. There are lots of studies which look at numbers of years of schooling, or let's say intelligence versus liberal or conservative unis and things like that. You could do the exact same study on that and come out with answers like what the natural, let's say the average IQ of the population of the United States is. Does that figure into any of your calculus, any of your work when you did it?
Not really, except I want to tout an excellent book by John Zoller. He's a colleague at UCLA. It's called The Nature and Origin of Mass Opinion. And he talks just about that. He says that if you have not necessarily a higher IQ, but more education, and he says you have more, what was this term? It's not something like facts, more facts at your disposal. So if you get a new fact, that in proportion to your total number of facts is small if you have to start off with a lot of facts. He says, meanwhile, the people who are not so knowledgeable, have only a few facts, and that new fact is a big proportion. So that lambda for the people who don't know so much about politics should be bigger. Right? And he has some evidence. There's some evidence in political science that the moderates tend not to be as knowledgeable about politics than the extremists. So I think that's a good point. Yes, sir.
Can I go back to the statistic that you cited about, in essence, some category of reporters being overwhelmingly liberal or democratic? So what's keeping all of these paleo-conservative types?
Great question. So I don't address it in the book, but here's what I think there is something in the DNA of liberals that makes them more likely want to go into the media, into academia, into the creative arts. Like I used to date a woman who was a dancer. All the ballet dancers were liberal. I have a friend in LA who's a puppeteer. Same thing. Some people say, they're trying to influence people. I don't really believe that, because puppeteers aren't out to change people's opinion. Ballet dancers aren't changing, but they're all liberal. So I think it's just something that there's something in the DNA of liberals that makes them want to go into more creative fields. They hate hierarchies like the military, or, sometimes like small businesses. So if that's true, I think what's going on is that even though the consumers might like a balance of news, they also want good news. And so if there's the bigger pool of liberal journalists, and you're going to pick out, say you're a newspaper owner and you want a balance, if you started giving affirmative action to the conservative journalists, the liberal journalists are going to be better. And so I think if you're a news owner, you say, well, okay, I could have a perfect balance, but I could have my news a little bit higher quality if I get slightly more liberals, people who really want to be there. And so I think that's partly what's going on, why we're getting this 93 to 7.
This DNA theory can't be right. It's plainly wrong, okay? I mean, Oxford and Cambridge universities used to be, back in the day, before any of us was born, the bastards of Toryism, okay? And Harvard used to be the bastion, you know, Episcopalians and Republicans, Oliver Wendell Holmes, people like that, okay? So there's it's back in the world. So there's lots and lots of evidence this is an inherent characteristic of the intelligentsia. It's driven by something else, and you know, on your account of it is driven by itself, which isn't satisfactory. So I mean, it's driven in part by itself, feeds on itself. But there has to be something out there other than that, and certainly other than DNA that's moving it. And I don't know of a satisfactory theory of this, so you know, I'm giving you absolution on this.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't know. That is pure speculation.
But there's, but you know, sort of speculating about that and finding some worthwhile explanations for what the exogenous thing that's moving this beast is would be very worthwhile.
I agree. At the same time...
I mean, I took your DNA as a metaphorical DNA. I didn't take it in the pure genetic sense.
I actually...
Well, you go back to my position. I mean, if you do survey MBA students and journalism school students, I mean, you find, you know, sharp differences in the labor market, really, that seem to pre-exist anything else we can talk about in the ultimate labor market. And I think that's really all you're referring to here. I don't take it as a genetic Oxford Cambridge thing.
No, I don't have much evidence, but my hunch is that there is something.
What is the media like in other countries? Is there any country in which the media is concerned?
I've not studied. I've asked friends wherever I asked. Basically, everyone. People tell me in Europe it is that the journalists in Europe are even more to the left than here.
What were they 60 or 100 years ago?
Well, good point. Yeah, if I'm right about the DNA, we should have seen that. Yeah, in the past.
Whether it's metaphorical DNA or literally DNA, there has been change. It isn't a constant, and that seems to be.
Do you have a site for the idea that the Tories were all in Oxford?
I do.
Okay, I want to read that.
It's the second volume of Macaulay's History of England from the accession of King James II.
Okay. Great. More and more, yeah.
But you know, they came from the aristocracy, you know, prior to the birth of democracy, and then they were Cromwell had a real problem with Oxford, let me put it that way. So,
but not as big as King James II.
So I wanted to, now that you strolled into the international question, it seems like there'd be some great opportunities for there's some natural experiments going on. I read one in the New York Times, I think it was today, where the new election in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas, Daniel Ortega, upped his vote total from 38% to 62%, based, according to the Times story, largely on his takeover of the media outlets. That he now dominates the television business in Nicaragua. So you have a quantification of there's probably a hell of a lambda down there.
I was about to say, that sounds like an even bigger lambda.
We might want to take a look at some of these you know, he's not screwing around with media bias, by the way. It's not a hint of subtlety to it. So, you know, you might want to look at some of these natural experiments where you have some, you know, serious intrusion into the media by, you know, government, you know, factions, and then see how that slants the, you know, what happens out of this. And of course, all governments have this interest, and so there are lots of things to look at.
That's right. Some people would tell me, you know, I should admit, if you'd asked me 6 years ago, you know, what's the lambda, what's the estimate, I would have said, oh, something like 0.05, 0.1. The rational choice economist in me says, oh, you can't fool people. You can't systematically make them, persuade them in directions you want. I did not find that. But nevertheless, if the media lambda were that small, or if it were zero, there would be no need for propaganda. Propaganda would not work at all. You'd not engage it at all if you're a dictator.
Well, or regulation, even regulation of the press is so attractive to have some kind of, whether it's a fairness doctrine policy in the United States.
Exactly.
Equal time rule, which has been statutory and is still with us since 1927. It was a protectionist device to make sure that, you know, opponents of incumbent congressmen don't get more time on radio or television. So, yeah, every government has an interest in regulating in a way that has some influence to, you know, protect political interests that are in the dominant coalition.
Yeah, because all those people believe that lambda
absolutely
is not too small.
Just all you have to do is listen to the Lyndon Johnson tapes, those wonderful tapes from the White House. You know, 2 out of 3 phone calls are to other politicians, and the third phone call is to, you know, Reston at the New York Times. I mean, why would the President of the United States constantly be calling journalists to make their case if they had no influence on the outcomes in the political world?
Good point.
As a comparative, I would be really cautious about setting it in international terms. For one thing, just like John Howard earlier, workbooks that used to be called third author, compared to the influence of media, found that it was much greater when media were monopoly plus the regime rather than diversified and competitive. But we also know that under the totalitarian regimes of the Soviets and Nazi period, half these studies have probably taken years, and certainly in the late, for instance, of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that you had a complete monopoly, saturation of state media, and, you know, there was a lot of corrosive skepticism among the population about the nature of what we were getting. So it could be that the lambda collapses when there is such great distance, something like that, right? And it could be that it becomes.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, I should mention that there's assumptions built into this. One, that everything's linear. And, you know, lots of economists will say, let's see if I can do this on the fly. So the way I'm assuming things, so if X is here, then if the media, this is the SQ, and this is the PQ, I'm assuming that it continues, that everything is linear, and the slope of that line is about 0.7. Okay, now lots of economists will say, well, look, there must be decreasing returns to scale, right? So if you start moving S way out here, it can't keep being linear. But the point I want to make, let me get a new color, that when I am all of my estimates of the lambda, so suppose that there is decreasing returns to scale, and that, you know, the marginal effect is less and less. All of my studies are when you're moving the media slant, you know, something, a small amount, basically from 60 to 61 or 60 to 63, something like that. So at this end of the scale, and if this is the true line, I'm measuring the media lambda as something like that slope, where the true average slope is actually going to be greater. So if that's true, so if economists are right, there's decreasing returns to scale, so that lambda is actually bigger, then that X is actually farther away from Y. Let's see, here.
So how did the media react to your study?
Excellent point. So, that's right. Here's what's happened.
Tell them about your Google search.
Oh yeah. So, well, the original article I'm not sure if this is the original article with Milo. You could, there was a time you could Google craft UCLA study, and I was number 1, 2, 3, 5. So those were all kind of left-wing blogs. But so the book, was there any interest? Washington Times loved it. Fox News loved it. Basically, yeah, here's what happened. Any media outlet with a PQ greater than 50 ignored it.
Number one.
Number one, pardon?
It's number one.
Oh, is it? I thought that was a long time ago. Okay. I've regained that spot. But talk radio has loved it. There was, I thought C-SPAN would like it because I talked about that. Originally when I did the article, I was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and that was the first time I was ever on national TV. I thought C-SPAN actually had me lined up twice, to be honest, and for some reason things were canceled. So those were, and I think C-SPAN has a PQ of about 50. So it seems like those in the 50 almost wanted the, almost none on the other side.
My experience is that people tend to listen to things on the media that agrees with whatever views they have. So that I might want to listen to, some particular news program. If you have a bias of 93% compared to, 50 or something like that, it would seem that people would start to turn off those particular media, and you get less and less sort of audience for them. Is there any evidence of that, or did you even look at that? Because that seems like a huge disparity between what people feel and what people are listening to.
Yeah. Well, okay. Here's one thing. So, if you look at a Washington newsroom, so it's about 93-7. That's about like Berkeley, California. So if they could elect a representative, they would elect someone like a Barbara Lee, who represents Berkeley. Okay, Barbara Lee has a PQ of like 105. Okay, so I think that the average person in that newsroom has a PQ very high, something like 95 or 100, something like that. So, in their hearts, these newsrooms have a PQ somewhere in 95. And by the way, this is all of the media, counting talk radio. If you just look at kind of mainstream media, it's like low 60s, maybe 65 is the way they report. So my results say that they are tempering their views significantly. In their heart, they want to report like a Barbara Lee speech, but for some reason, norms in journalism, their boss, they've got to worry about getting consumers to want to read it. Yeah, so they're moving toward the center about 2/3 of the way, but not all the way. And so, I don't know, did that
Yeah, that
okay.
Basically what you're saying is that it's not as big a disparity as I thought it was.
Yeah.
Because these people are moderating their views
Exactly.
when they report.
Exactly. And I think, your question, why is the mainstream media not reporting? They must hate it. Now think about, and to them, they're saying, wait, I am moderating my views a lot. And here's this guy calling me liberal, and, if they saw me here, they'd say, well, yeah, I agree. You're going 2/3 of the way, but not completely. Thanks, man.
One reason I asked the question about what was your basis for the 93-7 determination was that my husband and I both work as Washington. In terms of your DNA, just interesting comment. He's the son of a military man, and I'm the daughter of a General Motors executive. I think that, the way I read...
Can I ask real quick, your siblings? What are your PQs of your siblings?
I would say one is about 50, one is about 30, and I would say, in contrast to what this guy was saying, I think that dichotomy is confused by libertarianism.
Yeah.
And I think that's what turned out the discrepancy in the ADA's question about drug importation, is I think the libertarian would probably say it's fine to bring it in, and so it's something that doesn't necessarily, and why Ron Paul gets messed up is because of his perspective too, and so that's something that adds, I think, the challenge to the linear.
By the way, I should have answered your question, the 2-dimensional, real quick, if I can say this. I've been trying to get a grad student, you could do everything I've done in 2 dimensions. So instead of just using ADAs, you get National Taxpayer Union scores, and you get, say, Family Research Council scores. And there must be a liberal foreign policy group out there. You could do a three-dimensional.
I know Cato Institute or something like that does libertarian rankings, but there might be something else.
But someone could do it, and they could give the answers from three dimensions. Yeah.
But the point is going to make one of the points about the 93.7, which I won't necessarily disagree that probably most Washington reporters may vote Democratic, but a vote on a presidential decision is an A or B decision, so it's not linear. It's not like I could be 51 and 49 and still making that dichotomy.
Exactly.
And frankly, in terms of if it's so one-sided, 93-7, if the average slant is 58.5, I don't find that much of a slant. And as I think was said previously, that if it's that close, I mean, if it's the left of Joe Lieberman, I sort of have the same reactions the other guy did, and that's pretty darn moderate by today's standards. And also, I think if it really is there, that is, is not going to have sort of the kind of potential impact that you're suggesting it does. If the media was judged out there as 90% or score of 90, maybe that would be more, worrisome. But I don't get really worried by a 58. Because I think frankly that we do try in a lot of cases to be fair.
That's why, in fact, to answer your question, why is no media outlet, higher than a 50 PQ? And I keep wondering why some of them are going to report 58. That's it. I think that's news. In fact, some conservative friends have looked at it. That's all. So that's not very biased. And so I think that in some ways the surprise maybe is that given 93-7, that 58 is maybe surprisingly low. The other thing I think maybe the biggest surprise of the book is this lambda. That was what surprised me. Before going into it, I would have guessed that S is going to be something like 70, and I would have guessed that lambda was going to be something like 0.1, and I found very different results once I did the research.
Well, maybe some of that comes back to the point that someone was making about sort of the demand side here. There is a certain strain in the literature on media and media bias that stresses the demand side and suggests that in some sense the outlets give the people what they want to hear. So if the observed average views of the average voter are 50.4, if that's true, you might actually suspect that market forces aside from the political point of view of the reporters, to the extent that the media outlets are profit-making business organizations, maybe that determines in some way the range of content. And so maybe, I don't know if you could do this in any statistical significance way, maybe 50.4 and 58.5 are indistinguishable. I mean, I can see the difference in dots, but in a statistical sense, maybe they're actually quite close together.
Okay. Yeah, I do not have margins of errors on that S, and I could calculate it. It'd be a mess, but.
But I think at least in principle, that would be. In principle, one would really like to know, something about the units and how significant the difference between 50 and 58 is. Maybe to the extent that the sort of demand side is really important. Determining media, but maybe there's numbers
Yeah, in some way, yeah, this is the difference. So I can say it's about the difference between an Arlen Specter speech and something. What was the Ernest Hollings speech? Someone would say maybe they're not, but substantively.
I'm not exactly sure how to interpret that. Projected into the average, the views of the average.
Yeah. By the way, I
58.5 politician, put him in a 50.4 district and see how less likely he is to win compared to a 50.4 politician.
Yeah, right. We can say Levitt has actually done some work on this, like his AER paper, How Do Senators Vote? And he actually has something like this. I have a weighted average of X and S. He said, what if your weight of how you vote is your own views, your constituents' views, your party's views, and so on. And he finds, surprisingly, by his estimates, that 0.7 goes on your own heart, your own personal views. And only something like 0.1 is what your party tells you, and only something like 0.2 of what your constituents tell you. So we could calculate that, assuming Levitt's right. That so for every 20 points your district moves left, you would move about 20%, about 4 points.
Okay, well, we're about out of time here, so please join me in giving a hand to our speakers. Have a reception downstairs in the Atrium, and we invite everybody to join us and talk to the author and have a little bit to drink and a little bit to eat. Thank you very much for attending. Very nicely.
Hey, thank you.